Welcome to the Voodoo Power Podcast.
Welcome to Plates and Pancakes. We're sitting down today with Andrew McGhghy. Coach McGhghy oversees the strength and conditioning program at Rochester High School in Illinois. Joining the school this past fall after serving as the director of strength and conditioning at Macomb High School, where he was the Varsity Boys track coach, assistant football coach. McGhghy also has a podcast series that he does with the NHSSCA that's featured some terrific guests like Peter Noonan, Even-Esh, Dr. Eric Cash, Rich Grey, and Mike Crissinger. So welcome to the show, Coach. So I listened to some of your podcasts the other day just kind of get a feel for where you're at and what you're doing. So I know you're a Feed the Cats guy. How effective has that been when you were the head boys track coach at Macomb?
It was incredibly effective for me. Honestly, from there's all the great benefits of minimal effective dosing, all the things that Tony preaches on from a performance standpoint. But I became a Feed the Cats guy more so for logistics. So I took over, I was 19, and my first year as head coach, I was coaching everything. I had one assistant, and I was trying to run all these complex practices with very little to no help. And then I kind of stumbled upon Feed the Cats really because of Brad Dixon. Brad, big Feed the Cats guy, huge proponent for that system, and he was in the conference I was in. So I saw Brad's athletes, competed against them, and I would see the stuff that he would put out on social media about how great, and how well Feed the Cats was working for him. So I kind of started to implement it because like I said, I'm coaching throws and jumps and sprints and distance and whatever else I need to coach as head coach, and I've got one assistant. So what can I do to make my life easier? And looking at things from a practice standpoint through the Feed the Cats lens really, really helped me in my program. Kids enjoyed it more. It made it so much easier for me as a coach. And then from there, results started to follow. And is there a correlation between that and the increase in numbers? Perhaps, but regardless, we were getting faster. Numbers were up. And from there, I was hooked.
Now, Macomb's a pretty small Illinois school, if I'm thinking correctly. So I'm from a small town here, and the ones around us are all small schools, and you see a decline in track. And I wonder if that's due to the older style or a volume style way of thinking. Do you think that allowed more athletes to come and run for you because they weren't just going to get run on the ground?
Absolutely. It opened the door to the conversations with kids in other sports, in the sense, I had a kid that ran track for me that was also playing baseball. And because of the style of training that we used, it didn't crush him. It didn't, hurt him to do both. And kids saw that, and they realized, well, if he can do two sports and be successful at track, then if I just do one, hopefully I have a similar, success. And so I think that by doing Feed the Cats and keeping everyone's workload small, them feeling good, it did make it a lot easier to get kids to come out. Kids would go to kids would go to school and talk about track, and everyone always, there's always those kids like, well, I don't want to run. And, my kids would be like, well, we don't actually really do a lot of running. We jumped a lot, we lift, we play games, and we sprint maximally, once, twice a week. And it's not the traditional sense of running and conditioning and laps, and things of that nature. And even now today at Rochester, when I was in Macomb, hey, come run track. Well, I don't like to run. Well, honestly, you're going to do probably less running on the track team than you would in most sports, And so I do believe that is a huge selling point for Feed the Cats. It most definitely was for me, yeah.
Now, listening to you talk, your 400 teams got really good and seen great improvements. Working with the 400 team, did you kind of view it like Tony does? Like, the 400's going to suck. You're just going to have to run it hard and then train it to that idea?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that really worked out for me with improving, because the 400, when I was at Macomb, kind of did become an event at least in conference competition I could hang my hat on. And I think a part of that was I did a really good job of recruiting soccer players who had a nice aerobic base already. And so then we could focus on the sprint aspect of the 400. But to the same point, I do, like Tony says, it sucks regardless. Do you want to feel like crap after running a 59 second or after you running a 52? Which one would you rather see at the end, at the end of the meet kind of thing. And so, and kids realize that, because the 400 is one of those things that unless you are a well-trained distance runner, it's really hard to kind of get a feel for what that percentage is of like, I'm going to coast this 400. Most kids don't practice that enough. And so whether they realize it or not, they're going to run harder than they probably intend to, and they're going to be exhausted. Now, race strategy comes into that, and that's what leads to running that 50-second or that 56-second. But, most kids you'll see, whether it's a good time for them or not, they're still exhausted. They're still on their knees, kind of thing. Or on the flip side, they try to coast through it, and then they look around and everyone else is tired and they're not, and they still ran a bad time. But it is one of those things for sure that it's going to suck. You just got to do it. And if you're going to do it, you might as well run a good time while you're at it. Otherwise, what are you doing here?
Now, when you're preparing kids for that, are you looking at time-based training, trying to stay in the ATP, PC area, or are you letting them get up into the lactic side a little bit more? What are you kind of looking at preparing it going into that race?
I think of track, especially in the 400, almost to like that conjugate sense, right? Like we want to touch on a little bit of everything. And one thing with that comfort level is we ran a lot of 200s at goal pace for the 400. What are we going to come at? 24 flat. Right? We'll say that you want to come that first 224 flat. So we would do a lot of 200, and I say a lot, I don't mean we're not talking 20, but we would frequently try to hit those times that coming in at that goal pace at 200, because then, okay, I know if I want to run X time, I got to hit this time at the 200 mark. And then from there, kind of getting a level of comfort with that. And then let's stretch that out to 300 meters as the season progresses, right? I always did a short to long approach. Just to me, it made the most sense, and it was the most effective for me over the years. And so we would build up from 200 to 300 and then 350, and maybe 2-3 reps at most over a couple weeks. But we would always hit those marks and try to get a sense of comfort in running at those speeds. And that turned those 200s that obviously turns into a lactate effect. And so it was kind of a twofer in the sense that we would run those 200s, get the lactic effect, like Tony's 400 meter predictor, but also with the goal of not just how far can we run, but how can we run the X time, and how do we feel afterwards, kind of thing. If that makes sense. You
took over a program when you were really young. You were 19. You were just out of almost high school yourself. I think you had a little bit of college underneath you. So overcoming being super impressionable and everything you hear is just amazing, and you got to try it out on your athletes. How were you able to kind of find a route that got you to success?
That's such a great point that young coaches probably don't realize is happening. Is you're absolutely right. When you're young, everything sounds like the greatest idea, and everything is the smartest thing you've ever heard, because you haven't heard a lot to begin with. So for me, I just exposed myself to as many schools of thought as I could. I listened to guys like Tony and Brad and Chris Corfus. I went to a clinic in Iowa, and listened to Baylor's old head coach. And so I really tried to expose myself to as many ends of the spectrum as I could. And for me, it just was a lot of reflecting and sitting down, like, okay, what makes the most sense? And so that's why I think if you look at speed training, if you have Clyde Hart at one end and you have Tony Holler at the other, where do you kind of fall in line? And I consider myself, definitely closer to Tony than I would Clyde, but over the years I kind of started to get more comfortable with volume training to an extent. I wouldn't say that I'm a pure feed the cats guy. Guys like Ryan Banta really influenced me too, in that sense, and his critical mass training system. And so for me, it just took a couple of years of just trying to figure out, one, who am I as a coach? Like, what are my philosophies? What other coaches out there that I'm being exposed to reflect on those. And then from there, I still to this day try to do a good job of continuing to expose myself to different coaches and philosophies just to challenge myself. Because if I am just absolutely certain that this train of thought is the right one, and then all of a sudden I go to a clinic and hear something else and it shakes me, well then, okay, was I really bought into that first system, that kind of thing. But yeah, definitely my first few years as head coach, you're right, like I said, like you said, I was 19. I didn't know anything. I threw and sprinted a little bit in high school. But other than that, I didn't know what I didn't know. And so for me, it was just go to clinics, buy books, listen to stuff online, a lot of YouTube, a lot of time on YouTube, and just listening to people a lot smarter than I was. And then from there, taking the time to look at everything that I had learned, pro and con it, and then go from there, kind of make it my own.
So, I mean, at that age, you could come in a really hard charger right off the bat and take an already small team and make it smaller. But that's not necessarily what happens. So you got to watch a team grow from the first year to the second year. What kind of changes did you make maybe from a previous coach or a system that allowed that team to grow and the kids want to come participate?
One, I think I've just always had, I've always done a good job of connecting with athletes. And I think part of that is being younger to some extent, especially, when I was 19, 20. And I never tried to, I didn't try too hard to disconnect myself from the high school kids in the sense of like this hard set line. I was 19, 20. I couldn't act like a 20-year veteran coach because they would see right through it. So just being open with kids about things was a big part of it. And I was very open with them that, hey, while this team is growing, I'm also growing as a coach. And I was very vulnerable in the sense that they knew that I was also in a learning process. And I think a lot of them respected me for it, for just being open and honest about them. And if they had a question and I didn't have the answer, that I would find it, but I was just very clear, like, I don't know what we need to do here, or, that kind of thing. The previous coach, he had taken over the job, trying to make a down payment on a house, and that's why he took the job. And kids saw that and they just felt very uncared for, unimportant. And so I came in being young, very passionate, and made sure that I made them know that they were a priority of mine, and that this program wasn't something that I did on a whim, and that this was a dream come true, and that they were helping me live out my dream. And I think that because they knew I was so bought in, it made them easy to buy in. And yeah, I mean, that first year I had less than 20 kids, and we were not very good. And a lot of that was numbers. We were in a very competitive conference with the future state champion actually 1A team here in Illinois, actually my old high school. But it was a building process. And then the next year I was a better coach because I took the time to learn and grow. We got a few more kids out because it had been such a positive experience for them the year before. And then it just, the wheel kept turning. Eventually I went from, I think I ended the year with 13 or 14 kids my first year coaching, to the COVID season before it shut down. I had over 60 kids out. I mean, it was huge. It was awesome. And it was really something that people wanted to be a part of. COVID happened, unfortunately, which really was a bummer because I thought we were actually poised to make a pretty good run at state that year from a team standing. I'm not saying we were going to win as a team, but to, actually make an impression. And then COVID happened, and next year a lot of kids didn't want to do sports. All the parents that want their kids to do sports, that kind of thing. So, but now I'm very blessed to be at a program in Rochester where our head coach, Coach Blaze, last year was his second year as head coach. He's another young, passionate guy who's just kind of building this program up, and so I'm really excited to share with him what I've done over the years to make it better. And, he's very willing to listen. He's also a Feed the Cats guy, so philosophically we align, which makes it super easy. And so I think we had a lot of positive feedback from the season we had last year, and I think a similar effect at Rochester is going to happen to what I had in Macomb, where we're going to come in with, obviously almost all the kids returning from last year, but then bringing their friends out. We had a lot of soccer players last year, and I've had a bunch of soccer kids in strength training come up to me and tell me that they're going to run track because they've heard so many good things. So I just think that, sorry, kind of getting off track, but to go back to what you're saying, I just think that being genuine as a young coach and just being vulnerable to an extent, in a professional sense, obviously, but just being genuine and vulnerable and letting them know that I was very passionate about coaching them and that it was a dream of mine and that they were helping me live out, something that I had dreamed about. And I think they appreciated it and bought in, and then it just grew.
Now, you were talking about COVID season. I know you had mentioned this in a podcast, I think, that I heard it at, but your thought process changed in there, and I thought this was pretty unique. I guess I never really thought of it this way, but you changed your thought process from having a good season to having a good program. Once you kind of understood that, how did that change the way you coached?
Yeah, when that COVID season happened and I had this really good team and I had all these kids coming back, all my best athletes from the year before returning, new athletes that I had recruited from the football program and soccer program that were going to make a huge difference. I was so excited, because we were going to have this incredible season. We were going to repeat as conference champs and all these things. We were going to break school records, and it was going to really validate who I was as a coach. And so I was super excited, and then COVID shut down, and then that was gone. And we were very senior heavy that year. And so this was my year, kind of was the thought. And then like you were saying, I don't know what caused me to flip it. I just, reflecting on things one day, and then I just asked myself, well, why does this season have to be the best season I'm ever going to have as a track coach? I'm not even 30. I've got a lot of track seasons left. I was so bent on the kids that I had that I wasn't even looking at the kids I was going to have in the future. And it really hit me hard. And I felt like I was doing future teams a disservice by realizing that was my thought process. And so just taking that, flipping it on its head and thinking, okay, yes, it would have been a great track season, but why was I going to pigeonhole myself into thinking that was going to be the best track team I was ever going to have? That's silly, and that's not fair to the kids of the future that I would coach down the road. So that's when I really challenged myself, because I kind of lost that sense of desire for knowledge that I had when I first started out, because I started to experience success. We'd won conference a few times. I had state qualifiers, things like that. And so I kind of got in that trap of all right, I know what I'm doing now. And then COVID happened. And then that's, kind of when I had my epiphany, okay, actually there's still a lot out there to be learned. And I need to figure out what those things are, what those gaps are, so that I can recreate this sense of excitement for future seasons.
I can see where you just fall into a rut. You're having some success, might even be getting a little bit burnt out, and you're just using last year's program for this year's athletes. It could put you a little off kilter, and I think maybe COVID opened up realizations for everybody that, life is a little bit more than what we had given it credit for at that time.
Absolutely. And because it was such a longer ordeal than I think a lot of us thought it was going to be, there was such an opportunity there for growth and knowledge. That's what led to me starting my old podcast, the Coach Growth Podcast. That was started out of a desire to learn and just to reach out to other coaches, and say, hey, I've got questions. Can you answer a few of them? And while you're at it, let's tell your story, kind of thing. And so I knew, the first month went by, and I remember, hey, you can't practice. Messaging workouts to kids oh, hey, it's still, May's not over yet. There's a chance we'll have a season. Maybe it'll come back, and all these things. And, that kind of that realization of, okay, the season, we're not having a season. We're done. It is what it is. Once that had really settled, then the flip, I did some soul searching and knew that there was an opportunity here. And then there was, COVID, and I kind of think that we've gotten away from it as coaches since COVID, of networking, connecting, sitting down, sharing ideas, sharing thoughts. And, I spent so much time on Zoom during COVID and listening to other coaches that I almost miss it, really. Like I loved it. I had such a great time networking and meeting other people and listening to their thought process that I almost wish as a coaching community we could get back to it to an extent. But yeah, after making that switch, I haven't looked back. I'm very happy to say with myself that I have continued to look at it in that sense of like, what can I do to make the next season better? And obviously a lot of that comes down on what can I do to make myself better next season as a coach.
Now, while you're doing all this, I'll take this question, maybe the flip side of what we just talked about. You wasn't teaching at school. You was in hog barns, doing construction, doing jobs away from the school, coming in and coaching. So in saying that, how were you able to overcome maybe some imposter syndrome? I think everybody struggles for it or struggles from it. How were you able to balance that out in your mind?
That was really tough for me early out. My first year as the head track coach, I was working at a hog confinement, and the entire school day, I was unable to answer phone calls, text messages, emails, because we couldn't have our phone on the farm. You had to leave it in the shower. And so until I got off at 2:30, 3 o'clock, I had no idea what was going on with kids, and it was very difficult. And so over the years, for a while there, it was just me going from job to job. And I actually had to leave that job because they weren't going to let me take off for the state track meet. So that's what led to me leaving that job. So then I had to find another job that could facilitate a coaching schedule, which is not easy to do by any stretch of the imagination. And then, so for the first few years of my coaching career, it was just hopping from job to job that would allow me to have practice off and take meets off and things like that. And that was tough. And on top of the concern of just being young and inexperienced, the knowledge that I wasn't a PE teacher and I wasn't around all these other kids, like all these other coaches that I was competing against definitely did lead to a lot of imposter syndrome. It was something I wrestled with very heavily up until this is my third year working in a school district on a full-time basis during the day. And it has really changed my thoughts on coaching, and it has completely made my life easier from a coaching standpoint. And it is really frustrating for me that I waited so long to make it happen. But with the imposter syndrome, like you said, knowing how much I cared about my job and the fact that I was willing to wake up an hour early and get to a hog farm at 4 a.m. when we didn't have to be there till 5:30, but that I could get all my work done to make it to track practice when these other coaches didn't have to worry about that kind of thing, that gave me a sense of accomplishment and purpose to an extent, if you will. It made me, that kind of helped with the imposter syndrome of knowing that I was working. I don't want to say I was working harder than other coaches because I don't want to sound conceited in that sense, but I was going through struggles that they couldn't imagine to coach. And I was having to overcome things that, when we had our coaches meeting at the beginning of the meets, most of them weren't up at 5 a.m. scooping pig crap kind of thing. So, I think it made me a better coach, and it's really made me grateful for the situation that I'm at now, for sure.
And I don't know, maybe the one thing people don't know about hog farms, I'm sure they could probably associate it with it, is it doesn't matter what precautions you take. You just don't get that smell off of you. It's a whole unique job, I guess. I mean, even with separate clothes, showers, everything they provide, it's not that easy of a task. So I can only imagine going to high school track practice and listening to them kids badger you for however long practice was pretty rough.
No, and that happened a lot. I was working at the hog farm, and I was coaching. I was the D coordinator for our 8th grade football team, and the head 8th grade coach, who is now the head varsity head coach in Macomb, Tanner Hoyle, who's one of my best friends in the whole world, he straight up did not like me. He couldn't stand having me at practice because he's like, you smell. And I would come covered in green tattoo ink from marking the hogs. And yeah, no, I showered because you had to shower in, you had to shower out. It was a job requirement. It did not matter. I don't know how many cans of Old Spice and Axe I went through just to try. But yeah, it made no difference. And it definitely did not make me a fan favorite, for sure.
Now, obviously you enjoyed your time at Macomb. What moved you to Rochester? I mean, for people listening, Rochester's football legacy is unprecedented in the state of Illinois and maybe even the country. I see where that would be a draw. But if Macomb was kind of home, what lured you to a different school?
You know, it was actually pretty simple. My girlfriend graduated last spring with her master's in speech language pathology, and so she started applying to schools. And Chatham, which is where we live, which is about 20-minute drive from Rochester, they were the best school offer. And so, she said, "Hey, I'm going to take this job. Would you be?" We had a conversation about it, and basically was like, "Would you move there with me?" And I don't want to say nothing's 100% certain, so I'm 99.9% certain that this is the girl I'm going to marry. So it was an easy yes for me. And so I just started reaching out to area programs that I was going to be looking for a job. My last year at Macomb, I was working as a special ed aide, and those are always in demand. Especially, I don't know how it is in other places, but schools in Illinois are always struggling for paraprofessionals. So I knew that it would be easy for me to find another job in that line of work. And so I, obviously, like you said, Rochester is the gold standard. And I had been fortunate enough to interview Eric Leonard, the head football coach, for my previous podcast. And so I just reached out to him, and I said, "Hey, I know, we've never met in person, but I'm going to be moving to the Springfield area. Would you have room on your staff?" And I was at a track meet that night, and he called me, and he was like, "Hey, I'm not going to be able to pay you. Would love to have you. I really need another O-line coach. Can you?" He's like, and that was basically that. And then I reached out because yes, obviously coaching football at Rochester would be a dream, but track was my main concern. And I knew there weren't any head coaching openings, at least that I could tell in the area. And I do hold my track experience and knowledge in fairly high esteem. So I was going to be very picky about where I coach track. And I reached out to Coach Blaze on Twitter, and his assistant was actually leaving. So they were going to have a paid spot open. We had a long phone call one night and just talked shop, and he was very excited. He was really excited at the prospect of me joining. And after talking to him, I think, I felt very comfortable in that setting. Obviously, Rochester football was a huge draw. And so I applied and got, I applied for, an aide job, a track job, and a football job. And they offered me all three a week later. So it was awesome. And I'm not going to lie. Another draw was I looked in Rochester throwing, because I knew I was going to be the throws coach. Their best throwers were coming back. They had a 7th grader who was a state champion. And so that was going to be really exciting for me, the prospect of working with those kids. And last year was great. And so definitely the right choice. I know Rochester was where I was supposed to end up, and I love it. I mean, I couldn't have asked for a better situation.
Now, I want to get into throwing, but before we get into that too far, what led to the head strength and conditioning part of your aspect of the job there?
Yeah, so at Macomb, I was just a kid. I was just a coach, and I worked out. And so strength and conditioning was something that I was very passionate about, because it was, the weight room is really what led to me being any form of competent athlete in high school. And so I had a big passion for it, and I continued to lift once I graduated. And we didn't have a strength coach at Macomb High School when I started, and I knew that was something that would help my program. So I took it upon myself to educate myself in strength and conditioning as far as high school athletics and performance goes. And so that became, and I feel like strength and conditioning and track do come hand in hand to an extent. Having a track background kind of makes it easier for me to digest some of that information, because periodization, sets and reps, and all that kind of thing, obviously they're heavily influenced in both. So I took it upon myself to learn as much as I could about strength and conditioning. So I started doing all the strength and conditioning for the track team. And then the school would bring in grad students from WIU. And we had a different one every year. And it was kind of, the philosophies changed every year, that kind of thing. And so after the COVID season, the football team asked me to handle it for them as well. So I did all the programming for them. And then we got a new AD, and he was just like, hey, I think you're the guy. Like, I want you to be the guy this year, and I want you to be the guy 20 years from now. Like, we want one program, one vision, and we want some continuity. Obviously, unfortunately, then I moved away, so that didn't happen. But that's what led to that. So then I come to Rochester, and I was very forthcoming about that during my interview. Like, hey, I don't know if this is a position that you guys have, but if it's ever something interesting, I would really like to have a conversation about how we can make this happen. And they knew it was something that they were missing, and Derek told me the same thing during when I interviewed him. He said, the one thing that their program is missing is good strength and conditioning, and which always surprises people when you win 8 state titles and you don't really have a strength coach. But when I got to Rochester, a former player of Derek's owned a gym in Springfield, high performance company, and so they started handling the strength training for football. And they still do to this day, actually. Albert Stillman is the director there, and him and his coach assistant Matt, they come and they train the football team, and they do a great job. But I had a lot of teachers and parents kind of, once they realized my background, like, well, my kid doesn't play football, but I would really like him to get in the weight room. So then I started training a handful of kids here and a handful of kids there, and it just kind of, the numbers kept growing, and I was really persistent. And Coach Leonard is the strength training teacher, and their classes were very large. And Coach Leonard is the best offensive-minded coach in all of Illinois, one of the best in the country. But strength and conditioning is not his wheelhouse, and he'll be the first to tell you that. And so he was really big on with talking to administration and saying, "Hey, this isn't my area of expertise. We have a guy that works for the district that loves it, is passionate about it. Let's bring him into the program and help it, improve." And so I got approached at the end of the last school year, and they basically like, "Hey, we think you're the guy to do this, and we think you're the guy to help take that to the next level." And so they offered me the job, and here I am. Did my first full year in the role, and I love it. It truly is a dream come true. And I'm very grateful to Coach Leonard and Rochester as a school district for providing me this opportunity.
So what does your model look like? I mean, every coach I talk to is different. West Side 531, you hear VBT, you hear everything, and it's all working. But what's the model that's working for you?
No, you're right. When it all works, so there's to an extent there's almost no wrong answer. For me, it varies by population, so like almost all my off-season work is a triphasic model. We do eccentric blocks, isometric blocks, kind of thing. In season, I consider myself conjugate. So like my boys soccer team right now, we have a max effort lift, and then we have a dynamic effort lift. And then every other week in class, they're in strength training 3 days a week or 2 days a week because we're a block schedule. So then we have another dynamic effort lift in. And so in that sense, we're conjugate. Right now, a large population of mine in class are gym pop kids that actually, have no interest in sports, have no interest in working out. A lot of them took the class because they didn't think it was going to be a serious class, and I knew that going in that was going to be something I was going to have to overcome, and it's a work in progress, and I do feel like we're getting there. So a lot of those kids, it's just very general strength training. We do trisets, and it's right now we've just been running a lot of sets of 5, and then in 2 weeks we'll get into our first block of 5-3-1. And for those kids, it's core strong lifts, and then a lot of mobility accessories, and just trying to help them understand, and just teaching them about lifting outside of high school and outside, that kind of sense. And there's no necessarily like athletic goal in mind. It's just I want them to see weight go up on the bar and hopefully feel stronger and look better in the mirror, kind of thing. And for them, it's just 5s and 3s main lifts and some higher volume accessories that they curls and stuff like that they like doing, and that as the years go forward, and I've talked to administration and counselors, I do want it to become a larger athletic population kind of thing. A lot of athletes didn't take it because strength training before has kind of been a glorified study hall. So a lot of them just didn't take it. And so hopefully moving forward, we can kind of change, my goal obviously is to change that and get more athletes in there so I can do some more athletically minded things. Right. But it's just tough for me now because, I'm a feed the cats guy, but we can't make kids change for PE. So I got a lot of kids in there wearing Wrangler jeans and boots. I'm not going to have them run flying tins and jeans and boots because they're not going to want to do it. Their times are going to be great, kind of thing. So trying to, push the curve into that sense to hopefully next year down the road I can get more athletically minded. But yeah, just sorry for the rant, but no, I'm a big believer in triphasic and I'm a big believer in conjugate. And so I try to mold the two. And so I don't really, I don't only do triphasic stuff. I don't only do conjugate / west side philosophies or 531. I kind of like what we talked about earlier is I've looked at a lot of different systems and I just threw them in a blender and it's worked out really well for me over the years. I think that there's like you said, they all work. So why not use as many as I can, to an extent. My block 0 stuff is 1x20 kind of thing. And so I'm using that. I'm using triphasic. I think it all works. And so just using it all intelligently and not throwing it all at kids obviously at once either is a huge key. But no, I use a large amount of systems because I think they all have value.
Now, going back to something you said in there earlier, I've kind of thought about this, and I don't know how you manage it. So let's see how you've done it. But you said, you got a lot of kids in there that took the class because they weren't expecting to do anything. Now you're asking them to do something. There's a lot of resistance there. This isn't the class they thought they signed up for, even though the title says strength and conditioning or whatever the title is. To them, they were going to come in and get on Instagram, do their homework, whatever. How do you get buy-in and actually turn this into a productive class so that when your boss comes in, they see kids doing what they're supposed to be doing? How do you make that work?
No, and that is something that, depending on the class hour, is kind of a fear of mine. I've got a few hours that it's a doozy. And there's a lot of kids that just are adamant, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be here. And trying to do lifts that are fun in a sense, okay, I just don't care about strength training. 99% of boys want to bench press. So doing things like that, emphasizing kind of almost a bodybuilding standpoint with the male population has been big, and hyping them up and getting, those, just bringing a lot of energy with them has helped buy a lot of them over. And then part of it is the athletes that I do have. I spent all summer training the soccer team and I got a lot of buy-in from them and they loved it. And, every hour I've got a handful of those guys in class and they work hard and they are excited and they get after it. And it is infectious in the sense of hey, this is, but a big part of it is grades. Kids are coming in up to me hey, I only got 10 out of 20. And I was yeah, you didn't do anything. You're not just being very vocal and clear with them that your grade is going to reflect what you do. This is not oh, I don't, I just sit around and I lose a point. We use Team Builder, and every hour I run a completion report for every class period. And Timmy only did 20%, only put in 20% of their workout. And so by really putting a large portion of their grade on completing the workout on Team Builder makes them at least look at it. And so almost all of them are going through the motions now, and which is huge because the first few weeks were pretty rough, but almost everybody is at least going through the motion. Okay, maybe they're only goblet squatting with a 5-pound dumbbell, but by doing it and putting it in, in 2 weeks, when I pull it up and say, hey, you've been using 5 pounds for a couple of weeks, let's try a 10. And just knowing that it's kind of a slow process. But I've had multiple teachers come in and look at the class and just, praise what we're doing and the effort the kids are giving. And I think that's a big part of it, too. And just, I know that there's going to be kids that next semester transfer out, go back to elective PE. And I've been very vocal with kids. I don't want you to hate this class. And so if you elect to leave, you're not going to hurt buildings. Like, I want to train kids that want to be here. I want you to want to be here, but this is something you're not interested in, then that's okay. Let's have a conversation about it, and how can we kind of get through this semester together without you failing and hating me at the same time. So,
yeah, it's quite the balancing act, but understanding as an adult that, kids are still trying to figure out what they're wanting to do, not holding it against them. I'm sure it makes it a little easier so that when they do leave, there's just not this animosity that doesn't have to be there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, throwing is kind of your thing. You really enjoy the throwing aspect of it. So in the school you're in, you're getting a lot of kids that are coming out of another sport into throwing. So like basketball, wrestling, for your girls' side, you got basketball. Preparing them to throw and getting them on a strength cycle that will help them peak when they need to peak. How do you look at that and evaluate what buckets need to be filled while others are okay?
I think it depends on the sport they're coming out of. So like my throwers that play basketball and my throwers that wrestled are going to have different deficits. Obviously, if they were coming from basketball, the plyometrics, the foot ankle stability is obviously going to be pretty high, because all the jumping and rebounding and things that they're doing. Whereas coming from wrestling, that is going to be a large concern of mine. But whereas with their wrestling, their grip strength is going to be great. Their upper body power is probably going to be pretty good. Coming from there, basketball, maybe maximal strength is the issue. So it does depend on the sport. Typically, regardless of what sport they're coming from, I like to kind of throw a week or two at them of almost like a 1x20, and just kind of like a I don't want to say like cleanse the palate. Like 1x20 isn't something to be taken seriously, but just something kind of different, because we've been coming off of probably a peak for that, whatever other sport they were doing. So something that's a little higher volume, lower weight, just to kind of refresh, as what I've been doing that for the last 3 years now. And it's just kind of, I think kids like it, just a little something different to throw at them. But as far as preparing them, like I said earlier, my off season is pretty triphasic influence. And part of that is because as they're coming off those other sports, we're also, beginning to practice. And I've always been, my philosophy has shifted in the sense that I used to be the coach that my go-to, term was, well, I'm just going to provide what they're not getting in practice. And to now being able to be the strength coach and the sport coach at the same time, my goal is now to enhance what we're doing in practice. And so as we start throwing in practice, we're doing a lot of static throws, a lot of just holds and just loading positions. So we start out in an isometric block, because that's kind of what we're doing in practice. We're holding power positions. We're holding, different aspects of the throw. And so by going into the weight room and holding a split squat as an isometric, mirrors that and reinforces that kind of thing. So if that makes sense, right? And then as the season progresses, and after a few weeks, as we get more comfortable in throwing positions, and like, okay, well, now we're going to start slow and throw. Well, that's an eccentric block, right? And we're going to squat slow and then explode up kind of thing. And that's, because that's what we're doing. We're gliding and pausing and then exploding kind of thing. And so off season for me, for all my throwers, regardless of the sport they come in, is we're going to fall right into it. We're going to take like a week or two to kind of reset, and then we're going to start into a triphasic training block. And from there, depending on the sport they come from, is where the exercise selection might change. So like for my wrestlers, I'm going to do a lot more with Cal Dietz, like spring ankle stuff, and getting that ankle strong and stable, because I think that is like a missing component to throws that is lacking in a lot of throws training, is strengthening the foot ankle complex. So I'm going to spend a lot more time with that. And if they're coming from basketball, then I'm probably going to spend a lot more time on upper body strength in my accessory work, just because a lot of basketball players don't want to do a lot of upper body because they think it's going to mess up their shot and they're too tired, that kind of thing. So regardless of what sport they're coming from, we're going to get into a triphasic block. It's just the specific exercises might vary for kids for that first off season, like 6 weeks or so, if that makes sense.
Now, following this triphasic model and kind of what Cal Dietz has laid out there, obviously you want your throwers throwing the best when districts and state rolls around. will you follow a peaking model that uses his Circa Max ideas in that as well?
I have before, and I haven't, and this is something where I'm not 100% certain on what I think is best yet. And I know that's probably not the best answer to give on a podcast, but I have with some kids, and some kids I haven't. And then I'm sure no one's ever told you this before, but it depends. And so some kids that like I have felt like that's what makes them, what's going to help them peak the most. Some kids I just get the feeling that's not what they need, and that's where kind of the coaching eye comes into play. One guy that has really influenced me as a strength coach and as a focus coach is Dr. Bondarchuk. Transfer training, and obviously one of the largest takeaways that I took away from him was that athletes should be doing the lifts that make them feel the best closer as they get closer to their competitive season. And so for some kids, lifting super heavy makes them feel really good going into a meet. Some kids lift super heavy and they just they're nervous and they think that they're tired, and it actually has kind of almost a detraining effect because psychologically they don't think that that's what they needed, right? So there have been kids that like big power lifter type throwers that like no, they want to lift heavy, and so we will go into those super maximal things like that, and because that's what makes them psychologically feel the best, and that's going to help them peak. A large part of it is, to me, what makes them feel the best emotionally and psychologically when trying to peak a kid, as opposed to what's the perfect workout and set and rep scheme. So that's where the it depends kind of parts. So as we get farther into the season, the more varied the program is going to be, because each kid's going to want to peak a little differently. And that was like I got most of that from Dr. Bondarchuk, listening to him and guys like Nick Garcia talk about it.
And we could get into Bondarchuk here in just a second. I did, knowing you were a fan, I did kind of look into that some, so I had some questions on that. But do you think, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but as the training age increases at Rochester, you might see more of a uniform pattern across the board of what athletes want?
I certainly hope so, and that is the goal. My goal, and not even just track, just in general. Like my goal is to eventually have a unified strength program across the board, to an extent. And because I don't want to run a strength training class where I've got 5 different programs going, that are very different. It makes my job way harder. It makes it way harder from a programming standpoint, a lot more work. But yeah, I do think that as we get old, as these kids get older and they're exposed to my training philosophies and things like that over the years, that it will become more uniform. I hope so. I think that that's what's best for me as a coach and for the program. Yeah.
Now, going into Bondarchuk, I read up on that a little bit, and it seems like, his stuff is very Bulgarian-ish. When the Bulgarians were winning the Olympics, like very few exercises, and you just kind of grind them out and make it work. I don't know if that's correct, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on that, because I just don't know. But his system to me seems like it would be hard to take to a high school population. Have you found that? Yeah,
it's almost impossible to do if the kid isn't just a thrower. And that was like a huge takeaway of mine. And like I said, one of the smartest throw strength coaches that I've ever listened to is a guy by the name of Nick Garcia, who's out in California. He's if you're ever interested in learning about throwing and training for throwers, Hammer Media is a great resource, and he's part of that. But he was a huge Bondarchuk guy, but he said that if they do another sport, then they can't run Bondarchuk system because it's too it doesn't work. And I was like, when I first heard that, I was like, well, that's great. I just spent like $300 going through a Bondarchuk course. So I was like, what am I going to do? However, there's still a lot of things from Bondarchuk that you can pull that it applies to high school athletes. And, I think one of the best things that he did for strength training was his work in classification of exercises. And as you get, you go from off season to closer to your postseason, in high school, if you will, then you need to get more, you general to specific. And he was a big proponent of categorizing exercises, okay, this is nothing like what you're doing in sport, so you need to do that as far away from competition as you can because it doesn't transfer. And that's where, so he authored transfer training, and where that term kind of came from. And then you got your special development exercises, your special competitive exercises, and then the actual competitive exercise, which is just whatever the sport is. So for throwing, the competitive exercise would just be throwing. Now it would be throwing with heavier implements or lighter implements to get a variety of training effect. And I do think that is something that is very crucial in the sense that especially with high school athletes, when time is such a huge resource and that we're limited on how much time we can spend with them, and it's been a lot to training, is looking at an exercise and consciously, okay, are we just doing this to do it, or does it actually carry over to the competition that they're doing? Because if it's not, what are we doing and why are we doing it at that specific time of the season, right? I'm not saying never do something that doesn't reflect the sport, because robustness is a huge part of athletic development in the high school populations. But the other thing that his system was a huge proponent of, that I kind of mentioned on earlier, is you would have one workout from Dr. Bondarchuk, and then you would do that same workout for 20 workouts in a row. And the whole point was, you do a workout and you milk it for all it's worth. And then once you see a decline in progress, then you switch it up, and then you just keep going. And what he found is that each athlete has a very separate peaking cycle. It's individual to each person, which really I had never thought of before, but it was very eye-opening for me because, as a track coach, I'm like, man, some of my kids are peaking at the conference meet. Some of my kids are peaking at sectionals like we won. Some kids aren't peaking at all, haven't peaked yet. And, and I was listening to somebody, I don't remember who the coach was, but he made the point where, like, it's almost arrogant as coaches to think that we can make every kid their best at the time that we want. Like, there's so many variables that go into these things. And, Tony Holler, as we, spoke about earlier, says that peaking is, almost non-existent. Like, how do you peak a kid, right? But I do think there are things that we can do to make them obviously better at the end of the season, like we want. And so with him, the things that I've drawn from Bondarchuk that can be applied to high school. Obviously, I'm not running an exact replica of his system, but finding workouts that elicit positive effects, riding those workouts as long as we can, because by overexposing different stimulus in the weight room, it can detract from practice, and we don't want that. And then finding exercises that make kids throw farther and feel better about themselves is a big part of it as well. And then, so for Dr. Bondarchuk, they would do a workout, and then they would measure something, some kind of throw. And then they would just keep charting, and that's how they would find a peak, right? So, okay, athlete X peaks in, a 14 workout cycle. Athlete B is 16 days or whatever, right? And high school kids aren't that much different. And the one thing that Feed the Cats taught me was record, rank, and publish. And so what I do is we do a variety of throws in practice, and we measure them every week, right? The behind that, standing on the toe board and throwing the shot put backwards, lying med ball throw, and that kind of thing. And okay, is that going up? Perfect. Then we don't need to change anything. Okay, we're starting to see a decline. All right, now let's change up for the next 3 or 4 weeks. Okay. So that's another huge thing I pulled from Bondarchuk that I was already doing in sprint training that I just hadn't thought about with throwing. And so I think that's there are things that we can take from Bondarchuk that without obviously having to just use the whole system, because his system is very complex. It has to be done right in a certain standpoint, and there are just too many variables in high school athletics that I think that we can run a true Bondarchuk system. But there are things that we can pull from it that I think can improve the high school training experience. Don't switch up too often. Don't do things that don't help the sport, and don't do things that don't make kids feel good. And I've been doing that ever since.
Now with tracking, like Bondarchuk was doing it, he was obviously more in an Olympic cycle. So he had 4 years to really hone in on what the athlete wanted, where yes, you have 4 years, but you're giving up a lot of room in between, because you may have an exceptional freshman and you can't just tell that kid, well, no, we need to really find out where you peak, so I could see where you would struggle with that.
Yeah. And it's more tracking and metrics, but it is also important, I think, to kind of try to learn, figure that out about your athlete. And it might change over the years, but I think after, assuming, if they don't do a winter sport and you've got them training, you can, with the winter here, obviously in Illinois in the wintertime, we're not going out and throwing, but by you can do med ball tosses and things like that in the gym or an indoor shot put, you can kind of get a feel for them as an athlete. And if they do a spring sport and come in later, you're saying your window's a lot shorter, but as if you're tracking data on these kids and metrics, and I'm not saying like that sounds like a lot of work, but it's really not. One day you just measure your warm-up throws, and that's write it down, put it on Google Sheet and chart it. After a few weeks you can kind of see where kids are at, and you can, it's also, I just think it's a great tool for a coach to learn more about the kids you're coaching.
Now, early on in that, you got to talking about some pretty interesting stuff with the heavy light shot put. I've read some of Louis Simmons' stuff, and I know you're a conjugate guy, where he would have his athletes throw something that weighed exactly the same as a shot, but let's say it's bigger in size or smaller in size to keep the specificity from happening. We tried that with baseball a little bit. I don't have enough data to prove that one way or another, where we took big softballs and we drilled them out until they weighed what a baseball did and incrementally got to a baseball. I think it did show promise, but I don't know if that's something you've worked with or not.
Yeah, I think that it's important also just for variability to do different size shots. It's tough in a lot of public high schools in that they maybe have two shot puts to work with. And so, when our head coach messaged me earlier in the year, was like, hey, what do we want for track? I want a 10-pound shot. I want a 13-pound shot. I want a 12-pound shot that's 113 millimeters diameter, one that's 120, that kind of thing. Because I think that variability is such a huge thing, just from obviously different training stimulus, but also just because variety is huge. But one thing that, we did that I don't see a lot of other teams doing, and it doesn't mean that it's right. Maybe that's why other teams aren't doing it. But we throw indoor shots outside because they're bigger. That's they're a wider diameter naturally, so we'll throw those outside. And I have a lot of high school guys that were throwing with junior high implements last year, just because it's it's different. And with shot put, especially in a hammer, obviously we aren't working hammer, but hammer is another one that's you can get that conjugate practice, right? You can have a max effort throw session, and then you could have a dynamic effort throw session kind of thing. And so that's something that, again, like we tried to recreate when, especially last season, where, hey, we're going to throw a few heavier shots. And by heavier, I don't mean, not even 16 pounds, but like 14 pound shots. And we're going to do, a few, we're not going to do 20. We're going to do maybe 10 high effort. This is after drilling, of course. But we're going to do some heavier, high effort throws, and then we're going to go lift, and we're going to do some heavier, high effort military press or bench press or trap bar deadlift kind of thing. And one thing that I think is huge with that is it makes cueing a lot easier. And the transfer, not only from the physiological changes that athletes are making, but also from a communication standpoint. If what I'm doing in the weight room is mirroring what I'm doing in the throw circle, with the different implements as well as different exercises, I think it makes your job as a coach so much easier. And I understand that it's tough because a lot of sport coaches aren't strength coaches, so there's obviously some barriers there. But there's also, I know there are also a lot of sport coaches that are their school strength coach. So
now, I mean, a lot of the throwers that come out here, I have 3 really good throwers that should do really well in Missouri this spring. They're lifters. They like to lift. It seems like they kind of go hand in hand, throwing and lifting. When is a lifter or when is a thrower strong enough? When does more things need to come into their training besides just getting bigger and stronger?
And that's the question that a lot of us are still trying to answer. And you look at some guys, you look at the collegiate sense, Alekna, his dad, when he went to UCLA, he's one of the best discus throwers in the world. His dad was like, "Hey, don't make him any stronger. He's strong enough. He just needs to refine his technique." But then you have guys like Joe Kovacs who's squatting 1,000 pounds. 1,000 pounds, but he's squatting like 800 pounds for reps in his basement. He's incredibly strong, and he's one of the best throwers in the world. But when working at the high school with the high school population, I have very rarely come across a kid that I was like, yeah, he is strong enough, and we do not need to get stronger. Very rarely is that going to be the case. I'm not saying it's not, and maybe I just have weak kids. I don't know. But I feel like maximal strength is always something that can be touched on, and very rarely is there going to be a diminishing rate of return at the high school population. Now, Missouri, Jackson Cantwell is repping 400 pounds on bench as a 15-year-old. He probably at this point doesn't need to get any stronger. However, him getting stronger isn't going to hurt him. He's going to get stronger because he's going to keep growing. Maybe not. He's already 6'8", but you know what I mean. Like he's a kid, so he's going to get stronger as he ages. But I think every kid could continue to work on maximal strength from the standpoint of the effort that it takes for those heavy singles and triples and fives. I think is just huge for kids maturing out, in general. And so I think that that's something that my kids, no matter how strong they are always going to do. And just because I think it's important for them to, again, kind of going back to the weight, like from transferring the weight room over to throwing, is like, hey, heavy singles are hard, and you got it. If I've only programmed you to hit 2 reps and you fail the second one, well, there's a lesson in that. When you go to a meet and you've only got 3 throws in the meet and you foul out your second one, those conversations, you know what I mean? Like I think that, and I know that's slightly off topic, and I apologize, but just kind of going over, kind of over strength training. But that is to me where conjugate comes into play for my in-season model with throwers, and that if a kid is already really strong, then okay, we're going to have a maximal effort day, and then we're going to add in an extra dynamic effort day. Or maybe if you look at it in a 2-week cycle, max effort one day, and working on maximal strength stuff, and then they don't do it the next week. Maybe it becomes an every week thing. Whereas you have some kids that, Timmy, who's a freshman and can only bench 135, well, getting stronger is probably going to help him the most. And this is obviously all outside of tech refinement, which I think is something that, we'll continue to do to throw farther. We'll be better at throwing is also obviously a huge part of this. But I don't think it's that black and white, right? Like I don't think most kids ever get strong enough. But if you think that kid's approaching it, well, then cut down on it. And I think that's because there's such a huge variability in most throws programs between your kids. Now, if your kid's really, you've got a couple kids that are really good, are they really good because they're strong? Are they really good because they're fast twitch? And kind of, because there's always a huge variance in throwers. And then just looking at them from that standpoint, like, okay, I mean, Johnny throws 55 feet shot. He benches 385 pounds. Okay, he probably is, strong enough. On the flip side of it, Alex throws 55 feet, benching 215. Okay, getting strong. Like obviously the thing that's holding them back. And Cal Dietz was the one. That's how triphasic. He talked about that when he wrote triphasic. Was he had 2 shot putters. One was outlifting the other, but they were throwing the same. So one kid was quote unquote strong enough. I mean, if he's stronger than everyone else but not throwing farther, then it's not strength that's holding him back. Looking at it from that standpoint. But to make a short answer, I have never had a kid that I felt was strong enough. Right? I haven't.
I feel like bar speed would be crucial. While, yeah, everybody loves the maximal lifts, if it takes you 3 seconds to grind out a max effort bench press at 315, how well will that carry over to the shot put that you've got however many seconds from the time you take your first step to the bar or to the ball leaves your hand? I can see where that has to play in. So getting a more mature weight room that understands bar speeds and increasing that number could really carry over to the sport.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, you hit the nail on that there. And this is where I've not been in a way, between my two positions, I've not been in a place that has BBT monitoring capabilities, outside of my coach's eye. But you're not wrong at all in that sense and that's kind of where transfer training is, is it specific, right? No, moving super heavy stuff, super slow doesn't carry over in season, right? But grinding out those reps back in October and December, I think are super essential to build that foundation to have that big, competitive season, in-season stuff.
Yeah, and going into that, hitting on your dynamic days, you're grabbing that speed. It might be a sub-maximal weights, but you're slowly getting them where the intent of the lift is getting more important to the athlete.
Yeah, absolutely. And as the season as the in-season progresses, those dynamic days are getting a little lighter most of the time, and a little bit hopefully a little lighter and a little faster. And so that's the goal, trying to get those big throwers to understand that, because some kids, there are great throwers that are under 200 pounds. One of the best throwers that I've coached was also he threw discus at state, and he ran on the 4x4 at state. He was very fast twitch, and so some kids already understand that. But trying to get those slow twitch kids to understand bar speed, and you're right. The maturity of the group you're working with is a huge factor in the success of any of this working.
Now, I don't want to keep you all afternoon. I'll ask a couple more questions and I'll get you out of here. But talking about fast twitch, how beneficial is sprint training for throwers? Do you see any carryover there? I mean, they don't have to run the 100, but if you're working on velocities, flying 10s, 40s, do you see any carryover from the sprint to the throw?
Yeah, absolutely. And I always had my throwers, the only necessarily quote unquote speed training that they did most of the time was when we would run fly 10s as a team, and we would again kind of chart that. I actually just got a skyhook jump mat last month, and so I actually think I'm going to switch over from timing their sprints to just measuring their verticals on the jump mat and using that as my metric, because I'm a big chart guy, and I viewed sprinting for throwers, it's something explosive, and that's what throwing is one of the most ballistic things at the athletic events that kids will do. So I had them sprint because there's nothing more explosive in nature than sprinting, and so but I also use it to kind of keep my other throws program, my throw stuff in check. Like, okay, my sprinters are getting faster because we're doing things that directly affect their sprinting mechanics and stuff like that. Their times are dropping. Are my throwers' time dropping because I'm making them more explosive athletes? If that, what I mean? So I always had them sprint in that standpoint because we weren't doing anything directly to improve sprint speed. And if I saw that they were getting faster, then that was just a great, validation that, okay, they were becoming more explosive in general. I'm always nervous about kids not sprinting regularly, and then sprinting maximally and pulling something, even if it's once a week. It just makes me nervous, especially like a lot of my throwers are wrestlers, and they do very little sprint training in wrestling, and so that always makes me nervous. So I actually think we'll kind of cut down on sprint training, and because we will use the vertical as our metric to test explosiveness outside of lifts and throwing, obviously. But yeah, when I took my USATF level 2 throws course, they touched on it, like sprinting is huge. And I totally agree. I think that just, again, moving something maximally is dynamically is huge. And if you're a 250-pound thrower, and when you're sprinting, that's a lot of mass being moved maximally and dynamically. So I think it does carry over for sure. And I don't think you need to do it more than one time a week with kids, and it doesn't need to be more than 10, 15 yards. Like, I don't think you need to have throwers running poles or anything like that. They don't need to run a warm-up lap jogging. I don't think that has any carryover. But I do think, what is throwing? It's ballistic and moving something fast. It's the same thing as sprinting. So.
Now, I talked to a coach earlier this week, and we had a long conversation about what you just said with wrestling and sprinting. And the more I'm around it, the more I'm helping kids. I think that's an aspect of wrestling that's left out that could really change the way high school kids wrestle. You know, it's always conditioning based, and you're going to have that to a certain degree. But prior to practice, when they're fresh or whatever, if you could implement a sprint program, I think you could really build them up neurologically, get the fascia a little bit better, make them move better, make them faster, create more explosive athletes on something that doesn't even really take that long. You know, like you said, a few sprints at the beginning of practice, 2 days a week, boom, you're off and running. I don't know how that opinion sounds to you. It's just, it was ironic that you brought that up, and we were actually having a conversation this week about it.
No, you know, so I actually was our head junior high wrestling coach last year, and I took my Feed the Cat stuff to wrestling, and I cut practice time down. We cut out almost most of our conditioning, and at the beginning of practice, we did a lot of high effort drilling, and we would do our wrestling room was very small, and so our sprinting, we weren't allowed to run in the hallway, so we weren't sprinting, but we were doing some very maximal effort broad jumps, things of that nature that we could do in the space we had, and we had one of the most successful seasons in school history. And I'm not let me rephrase that. And then, we had some really good wrestlers, and, I was very fortunate to come into a talented group for sure. However, if you ask them, they would tell you, and most of them did, they felt more explosive, and it's kind of like you talked about in the 400. A wrestling match sucks. I ran the 400 and I wrestled in high school. I can tell you wrestling is I would rather run a 400 than wrestle a full match. It is exhausting. I mean, you're take your body weight, throw it on a barbell, and then try to clean it for 6 minutes. I mean, it's exhausting. And so if you feel faster and more explosive in that first period, you're more likely to dominate. Our big philosophy was we want to be the first one to score. We want to be the first takedown, because statistically you're more likely to win if you get the first takedown. And so by hammering that with wrestlers, hey, we are going to be explosive at the beginning, and yeah, you're going to be tired in the third period if you make it that far, but because of how dominant you were in the first period, especially at the junior high level, when there's a lot, when kids are a lot more emotional and things like that, if you can really hammer them hard in the first period, they're going to break most of the time. And by that being the focus, and then getting the aerobic capacity and conditioning from drilling after we did that, I felt like it made a huge difference. I think you're right. And, sprinting is, people say, well, why are you sprinting? They don't sprint in wrestling. You're right, but don't look at it as that. Look at it as the training effect. What's the carryover here? Sprinting is a maximal effort thing. So that, look at it in that regard as a tool. Don't look at it in the regards of you're trying to turn them into. You're not trying to turn them into sprinters. You're just trying to use sprinting to make better wrestlers. And I think, I'm totally on board with what you're saying. I think that's a great opinion to have, because it's the same one I have.
That makes it easy. I mean, looking at it across the board, especially in them lightweights, you're not going to see those kids squat 2.5 times their body weight, but you can sprint them and they can accumulate those forces on one leg. So you're still getting the same training effect. You're just doing it totally different than what the outside world may view as being productive.
Yeah. And you don't, kind of like one of those things, what's strong enough? If you're a wrestler, you're wrestling a kid that weighs your body weight. You don't need to throw, now, if you're a heavyweight, there's going to be a huge variance there. If you're 230 and you're wrestling a guy 285, sure. However, especially like you're saying, at those lighter weights, they're wrestling kids that weigh their body weight. Maybe there's a 3 to 5 pound plus minus in there somewhere, but they don't need to throw 2.5 times on their body weight. So what can you do that takes less time, than working up to super heavy squats, and makes them feel a little better and can be a little bit more competitive? And yeah, absolutely. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm all for trying to get kids to 2.5 times body weight squat for sure. But yeah, sprinting is just just another tool. And I think that wrestlers, especially, and throwers, it's not something that necessarily looks like it transfers, but it does, because, throwing super explosive, shooting a blast double, super explosive. How can we train being explosive? We can sprint, because sprinting is explosive.
Yeah, and the more explosive you are, the faster you are, the more you're going to dominate. I don't know, this may be an unpopular opinion, but I have very rarely seen conditioning beat strength, even in timed events. I don't know what you feel about that, but the stronger kid usually always wins.
Yeah. This is a conversation that I'm trying to have with our cross country kids right now. Their solution to everything is to run more miles. And then a lot of them are injury plagued. And I'm like, it's not, the mileage is what's causing injuries because your body isn't strong enough to handle running 75, 80 miles a week on asphalt. So you change your training ideas and come in and let's get you stronger. And again, not squatting 2.5 times your body weight because that isn't the strength that you need. However, getting up to a body weight barbell back squat and being able to squat ass to grass for a few reps and your knees and ankles being able to uphold that is huge. And like, that's going to help you in the, kind of extent. But yeah, no, I could go on and on.
Yeah, we definitely hit some side avenues, which they were very interesting. I didn't actually expect to get down those roads, but I think it makes for great conversation.
Yeah, if there's one thing I can do, it's talk. It's why I'm also a podcast host.
Well, this is the last question I'll ask you, and then I'll let you go. But I've heard you talk about this before, and I don't know if there's a way to evaluate it or not. But how do you decide if athletes are improving because of you or in spite of you? I mean, that could definitely, that could temper some ego. You know what I mean? But evaluating the whole, how do you help decide that?
I have asked myself that with almost every kid I've coached. Are they better because of me or did I make them worse? And I'll tell you, one of the biggest pitfalls in my coaching career was a young lady that was my first year coaching. I thought I knew stuff. I didn't know there's so much I didn't know. And looking back now, I probably hindered her career. She was a 3-time state qualifier. School record holder, fantastic thrower, D1 thrower. And I thought because she always made it to state that I was a great throws coach, when in reality, I honestly probably held her back because we were experiencing so much success that I didn't do what was necessary as far as throwing goes to improve it enough as a coach. So I've definitely had to have hard conversations with myself. Like I made, maybe not worse by any stretch of the imagination, but I've had kids where I did not make them better. And just being very open with yourself about it, that's a hard pill to swallow. That is a gut check, let me tell you. For me, it goes back down to metrics and testing. Like, okay, are they seeing progress? Yes. And I am not. A few years back, my ego wouldn't have allowed me this, but I'm to the point now where if a kid isn't progressing, I'm taking that video and I'm sending it to somebody and getting a different opinion. I had a kid, Adam, the soccer player I mentioned on, his dad's college roommate was the throws coach for Mizzou at the time. And he was like, hey, man, he's like, I'm not trying to step on your toes, but his name was Ross. He was like, do you mind if he helps me out? And I was like, please. Like, he's a D1 throws coach and he's willing to give you some pointers. And I was like, absolutely. Like, we're kind of at a point where like we haven't seen a lot of progress. And so absolutely go get a second opinion because that's what's best for you. And then you'd come back and be like, what did he tell you? He actually kind of says the same things you say. I'm like, validation. Awesome. But yeah, I just think that by testing things, constantly and as being like constantly challenging yourself, like, okay, why aren't kids getting better? Because there were a lot of kids last year that didn't see the progress that we had hoped, and having honest conversations about why, and then we could usually sit down and figure out, okay, what could we have done differently, either them or me, and that's something that really concerns me. I have a going to be freshman who is a state champion shot putter. He threw 51 feet as an 8th grader. That puts him in a very high level coming in as a freshman. 150 plus discus thrower, and he's a big strong kid. And he has very high expectations, and obviously he expects me to help him reach those goals, which obviously is my plan. But I have that a lot of pressure on myself right now, and like, gosh, I really don't want to ruin this kid's high school throwing career. I don't want to make him worse. And so I think that, I just, by constantly seeing, okay, are they getting better? Setting reasonable goals also I think is a big part of that, right? Like, I talked to him, hey, if you qualify for state as a freshman, we're on a good point. Because it's a big jump from 8 pounds to 12 pounds for a lot of kids, and if he comes in and he went from 51 feet with an 8 to like, okay, he threw 42 feet with a 12, something ain't right, kind of thing. So that's a big part of it. I do a lot. Last year I started doing, because I'm not a head coach anymore, I started doing private throws training, and that's really helped validate me as a throws coach to myself, because I have kids that are seeing progress, that have been training with me privately, that they weren't seeing with their coaches or in their current situations, and so that's helped out a ton. And for me, like on a personal level, like, okay, I'm not an idiot. I know a little bit, just a little bit.
Well, Coach, I appreciate all your time. This was a great way to talk about throws, because I got to get some kids ready, and I'm really starting from zero. So to have you on to kind of explain some of this stuff, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, anytime. It was really refreshing being on the other side of the mic for once. So I appreciate you asking. Hopefully somebody somewhere got value out of anything I said. But if there's ever any time that you or anyone has a question on throws, please reach out. I'm a nerd for this stuff. I love talking throws. I love talking training. So if there's anything I could ever do to help anyone in any capacity, I want to do it.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm sure the listeners do too, Coach. So have a wonderful rest of your day, and good luck this season.
Thank you, Coach. Thanks for having me on.